You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. It's Hump Day. It's the middle of the week. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. For those of you who aren't tuned into Odyssey right now, and you're listening to this show via the internet, or you're over on my YouTube channel, be sure to go over and check out Odyssey Radio at odysy1.com. You can see an entire lineup that's going to take you through 24/7 over there. So if you have time or you work at your computer, you need some good listening, some good talk radio, come on over to Odyssey Radio and check it out. And if you're just listening audibly and you'd like to see the video simulcast of this show, come on over to my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You can join the rest of the Intrepids over there in the live chat room, add your thoughts and your input into tonight's show, or just get to know some of the people over there. So come on over and have a good time. And here it is. It's Wednesday. How about that Super Tuesday last night? Now, I don't like to get into a lot of politics on this show, as you know, and I won't be right now, but I find it very interesting that Joe Biden comes out on top at Super Tuesday. The only problem with all of this is that nobody really wanted to vote for Biden, but there are so many people out there that just want to vote party line that they voted for Joe Biden. And then you have the ignominious departure of guys like Buttigieg, I think is how he says it, and also Amy Klobuchar, Amy was a little lower in the polls and a little lower with delegates and wins and things like that. Pete was a little higher up there, but I find it interesting that they both the day before, Super Tuesday on Monday, both drop out of the race. Oh, we figure we don't have a chance anymore because there's Bloomberg and there's Bernie and there's Biden. Wow, the three Bs, BBB, of the Democratic Party. And now I hear Bloomberg has already dropped out of the race. I begin to wonder, and folks, you answer this question for yourselves, and I ask it all the time. Look at all the millions upon millions upon millions of dollars that are spent in presidential campaigns. And the way that is justified is, well, we've got to have some great person at the head of everything that's going to lead an agenda that leads Congress into making good legislative decisions that benefit the country. And so people are like, yeah, okay, we can justify those millions. But I look at somebody like a Bloomberg. Now, he has spent, they say, over $700 million in this campaign. And then he's dropped out. And it was of his own money. He was worth $60 billion. Now he's worth closer to $59 billion. He better watch it there. Things are going to start getting tight for him. But he spent all that money probably knowing in the first place he wasn't going to win. This was all something that he did to prove that he could beat Trump. And he and Trump have been at it for years, back when Trump was just a real estate mogul and Bloomberg was the mayor of New York. So he had something to prove, and he did what the founders really warned us against, and that was somebody who could, and they use different terms than this, but someone who could buy an election. If you've got more money than the other candidate, and you can spend it without even feeling it out of your own pocket, there's not much that you can't stop. Yesterday, Bloomberg put out, I think they said almost $70 million in internet ads and Facebook ads yesterday. I found even watching some things on YouTube yesterday to have sidelines of Mike Bloomberg ads. Mike Bloomberg on Facebook, everywhere. My wife had signed up to get a free set of matchbooks with Go Bloomberg on them or something, or Mike Can Get It Done or something. Now, she doesn't support Bloomberg, but she wanted to get the matchbooks. She thought that was kind of cool, and they were free. And so she signed up for that. Now she gets ad after ad after ad after ad, and he was sending out messages to his people to go on to Facebook and promote the hell out of me. And so Mike Bloomberg, I just wonder, Mike, if you can get it done, and there's all these things, and here's what I wonder, folks. Could that $700 million have been used to do something better in our country? Could it have been used to, and I say that that's across the board, the millions it costs to market a political campaign for president these days, it's not for the common man anymore. It's, your regular Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Can't really happen anymore unless you get big backers that back your ideas. And so you got Pete Buttigieg, who, didn't have billions of dollars in his account, and look where he got. You've got somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard, who I find is very appealing, even though I'm not a Democrat, and I'm not a Republican either, but I found her most appealing amongst the Democratic candidates. But the DNC shut her down because she wasn't left enough. And these are, I'm using general answers here. So you look at all of this, you look at the money spent, and you say, how could homelessness be affected by $700 million? Could Bloomberg have pulled in his ego a little bit and said, I don't need to run for president, I'm not going to win, because he really doesn't have a platform other than, I have the money to advertise. And again, I'm not going to get into critiquing. That's dangerously close to critiquing politics here. But just say if the man knew he wasn't really going to win the election, and he threw all that money in there, could he not have used that to do something much better for veterans, for homeless people, for other issues in the United States, for building a wall? He could have given Trump money to finish the wall, but he wouldn't because he hates Trump. And so all of that, I look at Super Tuesday last night, and that vote was so divided last night. But Biden came out on top because you had Klobuchar and Buttigieg the day before throwing their support behind him. Remember the ad campaign that Joe Biden ran? Did you ever see the ad, his attack ad on Pete Buttigieg? Buttigieg, I want to keep saying Chegg. It's Jeg. They said you pronounce it Buttigieg. Really fast, so Buttigieg. And so he attacked Buttigieg for being a nobody, an upstart who was a mayor of a small town. What was it, in Indiana? His small town he's from. And how he sunk his money into building a new bridge or adding lights to the park. And that's all the further he ever got in his political career, according to Joe Biden. And all these nasty insults coming out from Biden against Buttigieg. And then Buttigieg on Monday forgets all of that. And it's like, I've always wanted to see Joe Biden, a man like Joe Biden, get in there and blah, 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 blah. So there you go. So how about that Super Tuesday? We know that there were some behind-the-scenes deals that went on there to have Klobuchar and Buttigieg drop out. Because Amy Klobuchar still got votes. Buttigieg still got votes in the primary last night. There were a lot of people who voted for them, the absentee ballot. And they voted for them weeks before they dropped out of the race. So, something to look at. That's all I got to say. That's my 5 minutes on last night. The delegates are pretty widely divided right now. But it looks like Joe Biden is working his way to the nomination. Who's going to be his vice presidential pick? Is it going to be Hillary Clinton? Is it going to be Buttigieg? Probably not. Is it going to be Klobuchar? Is it going to be Warren? Warren, she's the one who should drop out. So, you've got, and Bernie Sanders, what about him? I don't like Bernie Sanders or anything he stands for, really, for the most part, from a political point of view. But at least in Bernie Sanders, you've got somebody who's been consistent with his message for his entire life. He does seem to get richer after every presidential election he's in, but we'll leave that aside. So there you go, folks. Hope you had a good Tuesday. Hope you voted. If you're a Democrat and you voted in your primary, hope you're satisfied with the outcome from last night. It'll be a fun 9 months to see where this all goes. Let's move on, shall we? Because this is not the show for discussing politics, and that's probably the most I'm going to say about that. Moving on. We were talking about the Tower of Babel last night, and I wanted to pick that up. I thought that would be a one-fer. We'd just hit that, and I'd hit some of the topics about it. But frankly, the Tower of Babel, there's a lot of information out there that's worth going through. And I want to talk today about Nimrod. Who is Nimrod? This is the king mentioned in the biblical story who gathered all the people together to build this tower. And what was the purpose of the tower? And are there holes in the Tower of Babel's story? And I want to hit where we kind of left off yesterday. I was looking at a critique of the biblical story passage by a guy who runs a website that's called the Church of Truth. And he's really, he says he's a truth seeker, but really what he is, he's the opposite end of the literalist, orthodox Christian viewpoint. He's the other end of that scale. He's the denier, the atheist, the skeptic. And it shows through in the way he says certain things, because he uses some very demeaning language toward people of faith in his critique of this. But I thought some of his points were worth looking at. And we talked about the relevant verses yesterday in the account, and we talked about what he's calling the inconvenient, unpleasant truths that you find in the biblical passage. Remember, he said that the whole earth was of one language. He quotes that from the Genesis account. And he says, no, it wasn't. And he gives his reasons. But he uses verses that talk about how the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his own tongue, after their families, in their nations. And this verse is referring to the descendants of Japheth, one of the 3 sons of Noah. And we know that chronologically, the Tower of Babel story happens after the Great Flood. And so it's talking about how the descendants of Noah, his sons, all divide into the different races, the different cultures, the different languages. Now here's the question. Is that a statement of what happened after the flood, and then they go back and they hit the Nimrod story in the Tower of Babel? Or did they predate? Because they appear in the scripture, and the Tower of Babel story comes next. And so where it says the languages were all divided. And so this guy concludes that, and the whole earth was not of one language and of one speech, as Genesis 11:1 says it was. And so he goes on to his next point. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. They're talking about Nimrod. And he talks about how the Babel story is set at 3 generations after Noah. So that would be like, Noah would be my great-grandfather, and I'd be Nimrod. My great-grandfather lived in the 1920s, died in the 1920s, was murdered in the 1920s over a political debate at a very early age. I don't think he was 30 yet, or he was just 30. So that's the kind of distance you're looking at, unless you take into account that, remember, the Bible story talks about all these guys living huge numbers of years, but after the flood, it started to diminish. And so it's set 3 generations after, and Noah begat Ham, who begat Cush, who begat Nimrod. And Nimrod was what the Bible calls the mighty hunter. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, I know that there have been some, we're going to get to this a little later tonight, about Nimrod himself. The mighty hunter reference was he was the mighty hunter of men's souls because of what he represented, and he convoked a child sacrifice to the god Molech. So it'll be interesting as we get into that a little bit later. So how large was the city of Babel at the time? 3 generations after Noah? Who knows? How many people were inhabiting that? Could it be just hundreds at that time? Could it be thousands? Probably not tens of thousands at this point in 3 generations, would be my guess. Depends on how prolific people were after the flood story. And so there's no indication that anyone went to Babel with Nimrod. Other sons of Cush went together to form other cities in the land of Shinar. It says in Genesis 10:10 in the previous chapter, and the beginning of his, Nimrod's kingdom, was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And there's no reason to believe that there was anything resembling a city of Babel the way we think of cities. And maybe Nimrod and a couple of others, there might not have been anything like a kingdom of Babel. But remember, and I talked about this yesterday, about Cain. When Cain left Eden, went east to the land of Nod, married a woman, had a son, built a city, it says. Who did he build the city for? Well, the same word, archaic use of the word in the Hebrew, city, could have meant just simply a compound, a walled enclosure. It could have been just a family. So I rather doubt that it was just Nimrod and a couple of guys trying to build a big tower. And they left off on the tower. So they gathered all the people to them. And the third point this guy brings up, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do, says God. That's one of God's reasons. We got to go down and stop this. Let's go confound the languages. Let's stop them from building this tower. Why? Because if they can do this, nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. So the question is, what's God afraid of here? Does God, and I mentioned this yesterday, let's just recap this thought. Think about this for a second. Does it take an omniscient God to figure out that humans can't take blocks and mud brick and build a tower that's going to reach to the heavens? It's just not possible. So what did they mean by reaching the heavens? They built a tall tower. The idea that we get from this is that they were trying to build a tower, the third generation after the flood, to have a place to rush to if there's another flood, even though God had promised in the story not to ever do it again. Does that mean that the people didn't believe God's story? Or does that mean that the people kind of knew a little bit more? Maybe the flood was less divine and more natural. So is God afraid of what they're doing? There's no evidence of this loving, merciful, just, omnipotent God in this verse. Just a God who says amongst the other gods, let us go down and confound their languages so they don't become like us. So they don't get to do too much and get to know too much. And so what's God afraid of? Again, it's like that passage in Genesis 3 after the fall of mankind and Adam and Eve and the fruit and the serpent. And it says that Elohim said, let us go down and prevent them from eating of the tree of the humans have already eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and become like gods. Let us also prevent them from eating of the tree of life, lest they become immortal. And so what was God afraid of with his creation having that knowledge? Why didn't he want them to gain knowledge? Why didn't God come down and help them? If he could come down and see what they're doing and confound their languages, did he not have the ability, and this is speculative questioning, of course, the ability to come down and say, hey, what are you doing? Let me help you out with this. Let me tell you what you're doing, and so on. So he just imposes judgment on them for their actions. This is not omnipotence, because he seems to think that he doesn't have the power to prevent them from doing what they've imagined to do. So God doesn't know that he's omnipotent? He doesn't know he has all this power, that he has the power to stop whatever they're doing, and that's exactly what he does. The loving, merciful, just God just doesn't want his creations to live their dreams. He doesn't want to say, hey, go, have that, build that tower. I'd like to let you know ahead of time, engineering-wise, just basic math and physics, that you can't build a tower so high that it's going to reach the heavens. Just letting you know. He doesn't do that. He doesn't let them carry out their imaginations. It says the Lord, your God, wanted to suppress his creation's imagination, their speculations, their ability to carry out dreaming. He doesn't really want us to be godlike. That's the conclusion I get with that and other passages. It also says in the passage that God came down to see the city. Why did he have to come down and see the city? Does this mean that God is not omniscient? That he has to personally experience an event in order to know about it? Is there a lie of omniscience when it comes to God in the Old Testament? Then he says, let us go down. He says the plural. Who is us? It's the same us in Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden story. The word us implies a plurality, that there's more than one. Who's God talking about? This is prima facie evidence that there's more than one God. Now, some people will pass this off as the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. That's not what they're talking about here. Elohim, remember the word Elohim? Elohim, God of many gods, and that's the name of God almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament. Before you get Yahweh, which is Jehovah, which is a different personage altogether. And so it says there, let us there confound their languages, or confound their language in the singular, I think it was. And confounding language, that doesn't cause dispersion. To confound the language of a group of people wouldn't cause them to disperse. It would draw them closer together. Try to figure out, what was that you said? No one would leave a group of friends to venture into the unknown just because they can't understand their words. They'd find a way to understand each other. People who have different languages communicate quite well with gestures, pantomimes, smiles, etc., eventually trying to write down and figure out what each other is saying. It wouldn't be long before they would have evolved another common language. An omniscient God would know this and would not have been bothered to go down there and confound their language. And this is to me why this story, while the event may be a real historical archaeological thing, as we saw in the tablet yesterday, that shows the plans for this. It's a story that is filled with etiology, as we said. It's an explanation of why things happened. Why did people groups... you look... I watch some television shows sometimes, and I listen to British historians, or I sometimes look at paranormal television shows with British paranormal groups, and there's sometimes where some of these people are talking, they're speaking my language, English, and I can't understand some of what they're saying. I listen to people... I see people like my dear friend Amanda in the chat room, Amanda B., and even Jennifer sometimes. They use little words and turns of phrases that are so different from what we use colloquially that you have to ask, what does that mean over there? When you hear somebody say fair dinkum in Australia, we don't use that in America, that phrase. So we go, fair dinkum, what the heck is that? So, there are already language differences, but do you think do we overcome those, and can we all communicate? Yes, we can. So, let us build a city in a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Really? God actually thought that good citizens of Babel could really build a tower so high that it could reach him in heaven? An omniscient God would know there was no way to build a tower high enough to reach into the heavens. Thus, God is proving he's lacking omniscience, or he's being a deliberate simpleton to tell an allegorical tale. And let's leave it at that as we go out to break. It's the end of the first half already, believe it or not. I spent too much time talking politics. Sit there for a couple of minutes. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And you can see this show in its video simulcast over on my YouTube channel. Join the chat room with all the Intrepheads. Share your ideas. Get to know the people over there live during this show over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now let's jump right back in because I got way too much information to cover tonight, and I'd kind of like to bring the whole Tower of Babel thing to a close tonight, but let's see where we get. We're talking about this guy that's been critiquing from a non-believer's point of view, the passage. Now, I'm not out to disprove a biblical story, but I think it is worth our time as honest, critical thinkers to look at these passages and look at it from different angles and say, this is a story we grew up with, but is it true? Perhaps, like I've said, the Bible has efficacious historical content. The faith story is what gets wrapped around that and presented. They're using history to present a theological topic. So I've always said, I don't care what faith you are, if you step out of the box for a second and say you can take or leave the faith story. That's the faith story. But the historical event is probably something that really happened. And so, yes, there was a ziggurat built, and we know this. And we've got archaeological evidence that points to it being built. But the theological story, maybe they left off for a completely different reason than what the Bible says. Because the God that comes down and confounds languages, it doesn't look like it's an omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God. It's like a guy God that is like, oh my God, they're building a big tower. I got to go down and stop them and confuse their languages and spread them throughout the earth. You know, and I want to say at the same time, let the great beaver in the sky give birth and spread the stars across the heavens. That's kind of what it sounds like. So, all right, and going on. In looking at this passage in the book of Genesis, it says that God came down to scatter the people abroad the face of all the earth. And so the inhabitants were each individually scattered abroad the face of all the earth. Okay, so the 10, 20 inhabitants of the city of Babel, or 100, 200, 1,000, 2,000, whatever it is at this point, with the exponential spread of families, 3 generations after Noah and his 3 sons are the only dads left on the planet, and their wives. And so in 3 generations, how many people do we have at Babel? And it says the inhabitants were all scattered all over the earth, and of all the earth, it says, and by the way, that would include the continents of Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, South America. No, it wouldn't. I believe when they're talking about all the earth in archaic contexts, they are talking about the known earth. And that would have been probably the Euphrates River Valley, down into the Canaanite region, Mesopotamia a bit. That's the region. That is all the earth in context then. And it's asked, how is it then that there's so many more languages today than there were dispersed inhabitants of Babel? And the only way new languages form is when God comes down and confounds the language. And the Bible tells us of only one time that he did so. And then there should be only a handful of languages, right? The most extensive catalog of the world's languages, generally taken to be as authoritative as any, is that of Ethnologue, published by SIL International, whose detailed classification list as of 2009, 11 years ago, included 6,909 distinct languages. Were there even that many people at Babel? I don't know. So the Tower of Babel fable presents God as not being very, very omniscient, but rather it almost presents this dim-witted God that is either dim-witted because he is or dim-witted because he chooses to play dumb. to do what he's doing. This is an account, a theological account of God's actions to mankind as an etiology to describe why there were different languages when that isn't the real explanation at all. This is a way to... It's definitely got all the earmarks of being written by some guy and saying, hey, here's maybe, did Moses pen this in Genesis? Was it penned earlier than Moses? It's such an oversimplistic view of who God is and the attributes of God and the God we're supposed to come and know. A very different God than is presented in literalist Orthodox Christianity thousands of years later. So it's kind of in a way, it's a bit of a nonsense story. Not the historical account, but the way they describe God and his actions and his personality in this. It's simply an attempt by Bronze Age man to explain different languages, like the stars in the sky, which would have been a real mystery to the ignorant people of the time. It shows that if there is a God, he might not be very powerful or maybe not very smart. And that's what, to me, detracts from the reality of the theological tale that's been presented. And so the truth of this all is that the earth was never of one speech. The history of language is as full and complex as the history of mankind. It's patently obvious that anyone with a working, critical thinking mind will look at this story as either an attempt of what we call the JEDP theory, and I've talked about that many times. It'd take a whole episode to reignite that, but the theories, the hypotheses about ancient biblical text to explain how different languages came to be. And so there you go. Whoever wrote this account in the book of Genesis was unaware of those explanations. So now I want to go to Nimrod, because it says this is an interesting study all by itself. And we got about 19 minutes to do this left in this program tonight. I want to talk about who Nimrod was and why Nimrod did what he did. First of all, historically, Nimrod. Who the hell is Nimrod? And so the whole modern Hebrew, the Tiberian Hebrew, Nimrod, the Aramaic has him. The biblical figure described as a king in the land of Shinar in Mesopotamia. That's what Shinar was, according to the book of Genesis and the book of Chronicles, the son of Cush, who was the son of Japheth, who was the son of Noah. And he was the grandson of Ham and the great-grandson of Noah. And so the Bible states that, it was Ham, not Japheth. And the Bible states that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and he began to be mighty in the earth, is what the Bible says. Now, extra-biblical traditions associating with the Tower of Babel led to his reputation as a king who was rebellious against God. Only 3 generations after a great flood where God wiped everything out. Hey, great-grandpa's God isn't real. I'm going to be rebellious against his God. And so attempts to match Nimrod historically with the historically attested figures have failed. Nimrod may not represent any one personage known to history, and various authors have identified him with several real and fictional figures of Mesopotamian antiquity, including the Mesopotamian god Ninurta, or a conflation of 2 Akkadian kings, Sargon and his grandson, Naram-Sin. And these were all in the 2200 years BCE. So we're talking a good 4,500 years ago. And Tukulti-Ninurta, who was in the 1200s BCE. And so in the biblical account, the first biblical mention of Nimrod is in the Table of Nations. He's described as the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham, great-grandson of Noah, and as a mighty one in the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord. And this repeated in the first book of Chronicles, 1:10. It says, the land of Nimrod, used as a synonym for Assyria or Mesopotamia, and it's mentioned in the book of Micah even. So, Micah 5:6. And they shall lay waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrance thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian, when he cometh into our land, and he treadeth within our borders. Now, Genesis says that the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom, where the towns of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, Mesopotamia, that's in Genesis 10:10, understood variously to imply that they either founded these cities, ruled over them, or both. Owing to an ambiguity in the original Hebrew text, it's unclear whether it's Nimrod or Asher who additionally built Nineveh, Resen, Rehoboth, and Calah. Both interpretations are reflected in various English versions. Sir Walter Raleigh devoted several pages in his History of the World. In 1616 he wrote this, great explorer Sir Walter Raleigh, to reciting past scholarship regarding the question of whether it had been Nimrod or Asher who built the cities in Assyria. Now, I never thought of Sir Walter Raleigh as being a great historian. He was a great adventurer, but he wrote his book. So it's the idea that has been questioned. There's traditions and there's legends. In the Hebrew and in the Christian tradition, Nimrod is considered the leader of those who built the Tower of Babel in the land of Shinar, though the Bible never actually states this. Nimrod's kingdom included the cities of Babel, of Erech, of Akkad, and perhaps Calneh in Shinar. And Flavius Josephus, who we've talked about before in the history of Jesus, believed that it was likely under his direction, Nimrod's direction, that the building of Babel and its tower began. In addition to Josephus, this is also the view found in the Talmud, Jewish writings, and later the Midrash, the Jewish writings, such as Genesis Rabbah. And several of these early Judaic sources also assert that the king Amraphel, who wars with Abraham later in the book of Genesis, is none other than Nimrod himself. Perhaps Nimrod was a title, not the name. It's like we see Hatshepsut, the Egyptian pharaoh. She had a birth name and a regnal name. Birth name was Matkare. She became Hatshepsut. Same with Tutmosis I, Tutmosis II, Tutmosis III, Amenhotep. All these guys had their birth names, and then they had their regnal names. Now, since Akkad, remember we've talked about Sumer and Akkad, like the god Enki, and Enki was known as Enki in Sumer, and he was known as Ea in Akkad. That's where we get Enki Ea, and Ea being the base word 1,500 years later in the Canaanite culture, as Ea became Yahweh and Jehovah, and so on. So this name, Akkad, that was destroyed and lost with the destruction of its empire in the period of 2200 BC thereabouts. And the stories mentioning Nimrod seem to recall the late early Bronze Age and the association with Erech, Babylonian Uruk, which we talked about yesterday, a city that lost its prime importance around 2000 BCE as a result of struggles between Isin, Larsa, and Elam. I know I'm giving you a lot of history here, but this is all to establish Nimrod. It also attests the early province of the stories of Nimrod. And according to some modern-day theorists, their placement in the Bible suggests a Babylonian origin, possibly inserted during the Babylonian captivity. Now that's an important point. Remember this. Remember how I said the books of Moses, when we were looking at them, later in the history of Israel, almost 500 to 600 years later, Israel is sacked by Babylon. They're carried off into Babylonian captivity. And 100, 200 years later, they are released to go back to their homeland. And so the children of Israel all go back to Israel. They rebuild the temple. They send the 72 rabbis to the Library of Alexandria. That ringing a bell? We've talked about this before. And they went there under the permission of Pharaoh Ptolemy II to reconstruct the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is 1,000 years after the time of Moses and the Exodus. They're reconstructing the books of Moses, the Torah. They're reconstructing the rest of the Old Testament Scriptures to establish the history of Israel and to solidify the faithful Jews. And they do this right around 400 thereabouts BCE. And so they're reconstructing this. Now remember, they are coming out from under Babylonian influence. Are the things they learned in Babylon, did that have this influence of Nimrod, the city of Babel, and so on the stories? Judaic interpretations as early as Philo and Yochanan ben Zakkai in the 1st century A.D. interpreted a mighty hunter before the Lord in the face of Yahweh, not meaning in your face, Yahweh, just meaning in the face, before Yahweh, as signifying in opposition to the Lord. So maybe that is what that means. An early version of in your face, Yahweh. He was in opposition to the Lord. This Nimrod, the mighty hunter. And a similar interpretation is found in the Pseudo-Philo, as well as later in this Samachus. Some rabbinic commentaries have also connected the name Nimrod with a Hebrew word meaning rebel in Pseudo-Philo. Which is dated 70 AD. I'm giving you stuff. You're not going to go to work tomorrow and go, hey, you ever read the Pseudo-Philo? It's not like daily knowledge, but this is stuff that gives us a little meat about these Bible stories. Nimrod is made the leader of the Hamites. Remember Ham, one of the sons of Noah? While Joktan as leader of the Semites, and Phenech as the leader of the Japhethites. Japhethites. And it's also associated with the building of the tower. Now, versions of this story are again picked up later in works such as the Apocalypse of the Pseudo-Methodius in the 7th century A.D. The Book of Jubilees mentions the name of Nimrod, the Greek form of Nimrod, only as being the father of Azurad, and the wife of Eber, and the mother of Peleg. And this account would make Nimrod an ancestor of Abraham's, and hence of all the Hebrews. Here's what Josephus wrote in his work, and I think this is kind of interesting to read, and we've only got, we've got 9 minutes left here. We can do this. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them, this would be the people, to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured the happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his own power. He also said he would be revenged on God, if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying his forefathers, and all the forefathers of the people. He's rallying the people to rebel against God. And now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains, nor being in any degree negligent about the work, and by reason of the multitude of the hands that employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar, made of bitumen. That's the same resin that they put in the mummies when they take stuff out, of the brain out and things like that. And it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, He did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners, but he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through the multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. And the place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. Now that was all from Josephus. That was his interpretation of that event. Now remember, he's drawing on stuff that maybe there's source points that he had that we don't have. He's got little tidbits of information in there that are different than what we know. So an early Arabic work known as the Kitab el-Maghali, or the Book of Rolls, that's R-O-L-L-S, it's part of the Clementine literature, states that Nimrod built the towns of Hadanun, Eleasar, Seleucia, Ctesiphon, some of these names I haven't run across many times, Ruhin, Atropatene, Telanan, and others. He built these cities. And that he began his reign as king over the earth when Ru was 163 years old, and that he reigned for 69 years, building Nisibis, Raha, Edessa, and Haran, when Peleg was 50. These are all biblical names. And it further adds that Nimrod saw in the sky a piece of black cloth and a crown, and he called upon Sasan the weaver and commanded him to make him a crown like it, which he set jewels on and wore. And he was allegedly the first king to wear a crown. For this reason, the people who knew nothing about it said that a crown came down to him from heaven. Later, the book describes how Nimrod established fire worship and idolatry. He received instruction in divination for 3 years from Buneter, the fourth son of Noah, who's not mentioned in the biblical account. And in the Recognitions, one version of the Clementines, Nimrod is equated with the legendary Assyrian king Ninus, who first appears, Ninus, who appears in the Greek history, in the Greek historian Ctesisis as the former of Nimrod. There you go. It's all these resources. However, in another version, the homilies, Nimrod is made to be the same as Zoroaster, which is very interesting. Following in the ways of Zoroaster. The Syriac Cave of Treasures contains an account of Nimrod, very similar to that in the Kitab el-Maghal, except that Nisibis, Edessa, and Haran are said to be built by Nimrod when Ru was 50. Not 159, whatever it was, and that he began his reign as the first king when Ru was 130. And in this version, the weaver is called Sisan, and the fourth son of Noah is called Yontan. Jerome, church historian, writing in 390 A.D., explains in Hebrew Questions on Genesis that after Nimrod reigned in Babel, he also reigned in Erech, or Eric, and that is Edessa, and in Akkad, which is now called Nisibis, and in all these other cities. I don't have to keep reciting them, which was later called Seleucia, after the king Seleucus, when its name had been changed, and which is now in fact called Ctesiphon. And however, this traditional identification of the cities built by Nimrod in Genesis is no longer accepted by modern scholars, who consider them to be located in Sumer and not in Syria. And there's many other sources that we can start going through. And you've got this, again, this could be 10 more shows on this. Ephraim the Syrian, Tegum Pseudo-Jonathan. You've got the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. You've got the History of the Prophets and Kings by the 9th century Muslim historian Al-Tabari. You've got Aram, the son of Shem, the Nabateans, in Armenian legends, Hungarian legends, Ladislas, the Kuman. You've got Hunar and Magor and so on and so forth. All these things. The Nimrod fortress, which is called at Nimrod in Arabic on the Golan Heights, actually built during the Crusades by Al-Aziz Uthman, the younger son of Saladin, was anachronistically attributed to Nimrod by later inhabitants of the area. But it wasn't at all. And of course, we're running up on the end of the show, and I'm getting on this section. I want to talk about the evil Nimrod versus the righteous Abraham. Abraham called out from the Ur of the Chaldees, which, by the way, they discovered. The ziggurat in Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham came from. He was the high priest's son. He was probably a priest himself. And God called him out, and Abraham became the father of Israel. And his son, the son was Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob being the same name as Israel. And so there is an evil Nimrod versus the righteous Abraham. And we don't have time to get into it tonight. There was a confrontation between Nimrod and Abraham that's said to have taken place according to several Jewish and Islamic traditions. Some stories bring them both together in this cataclysmic collision, seen as a symbol of the confrontation between good and evil, and or as a symbolic or a symbolism of monotheism versus polytheism. And some Jewish traditions say that only the two men met and had a discussion. And you know what? Let's talk about that tomorrow. Let's talk about Abraham and Nimrod and the conflict that's laid out there. And as for now, we're at the end of the show, because I can't really justify getting any deeper into this material than we've already gotten tonight. And so we're going to come back to this, but it's going to be less about the Tower of Babel and more about Nimrod himself, the king who is said to have built the Tower of Babel, and what he represents. And did he have conflict with Abraham? Abraham dating back that far. And so let's take a look at that tomorrow. Thanks for being here tonight, folks. I wish we had more time. I do a 2-hour show, but I just can't. One of these nights, maybe even tonight, we'll go live afterwards over on my YouTube channel, just to meet and chat and stuff like that. But we'll cover this now tomorrow. So be back tomorrow, 23-hour break, and I'll see you here. Good night.